Now, he said he stopped short of advocating revolutionary violence. In fact, he said the freedom of Ireland wasn't worth the shedding of a single drop of blood, which is a very nice idea, but it didn't stop O'Connell killing a man in a pistol duel early in his career. And more seriously, it didn't stop the British government from threatening or from using force. So, for example, in 1843, when O'Connell planned for a monster meeting on the outskirts of Dublin, this was far too close to the seat of power as far as the British were concerned, so they banned the meeting. And they also threatened to send in the army to disperse it. So O'Connell backed down. He cancelled the meeting. He blinked, if you like. But his movement never recovered from that loss of face. And he died in 1847 without realising his ambition of repeal. Nevertheless, O'Connell is regarded as the father of constitutional nationalism, non-violent nationalism. Now, in its makeup, his movement was almost entirely Catholic. That's hardly a surprise, because his original movement was one for Catholic rights. But then he moved into demanding national rights, a colonial parliament. Now, that had the unfortunate consequence that it identified Catholicism with nationalism. And increasingly, non-Catholics, Church of Ireland Protestants, Presbyterians, they began to drift away into a pro-British position, or a unionist position. And that included the Presbyterians, the Calvinists, who I explained earlier were the people who founded the revolutionary Republican movement. Remember, back in the 1790s, in 1798, Ulster Presbyterians fought for an Irish Republic against the British, but within one or two generations, they began to gradually become pro-British in their politics. The question is, why? Why did their position change? Now, it's a very complex question, but I think the underlying factor was economic. The northeastern part of Ireland, centred on Belfast, was the only part of Ireland to industrialise in the 19th century. Initially, why? I'd like to answer difficult questions here.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, why? Remember, this part of Ireland was planted by these Scots Presbyterians. Now, these are pretty hard-nosed guys. Yeah. So you have to, you're trying to persuade these guys to come into a war zone, right? They just conquered the native Irish. So you had to give them a good deal in terms of, their conditions. Now, these guys are tenant farmers down at the base, right? So the good deal they got was called the Ulster Custom. They were given security of tenure. That meant that if they abided by the rules, paid their rent, they could not be evicted. Moreover, if the landlord wanted to repossess the property, he had to pay them compensation. He also had to compensate them for any improvements made. In other words, they had an incentive to improve, to accumulate. That accumulated wealth was then reinvested initially in linen production. You might have a loom at the back, a little sideline. That gradually then snowballs into larger and larger units of production. Your Catholic tenant, meanwhile, he's a tenant at will. He can be evicted at any time, even if he pays the rent. So therefore, he's no incentive to accumulate. And this led to what was known as the Bail Bucht, literally the poor mouth, where any money that had, they stuff it in the mattress, look as poor as possible. And of course, the farmers are still doing it today. Anyone know a farmer who's making money? No, because I never met one. But anyway, I'm joking, of course. So, in other words, there was an incentive to accumulate. Raw materials then weren't a problem. They could be imported from Scotland, short sea journey and so on. Yeah. So a combination of all those factors. And like any industrializing process, it sort of takes off, and then it takes off like a rocket. In other words, once you get the ball rolling, it tends to accelerate. So it then had a different economic development than the Catholic part. Meanwhile, in the Catholic part, as I've already explained, people are suffering famine, poverty, emigration, deindustrialization. Now, as someone once famously put it, it's the economy, stupid. In other words, people's political choices tend to be determined by their material experience, which was relatively benign in the Protestant Northeast, anything but in the Catholic South. Now, there's more to it than that, of course. There were also religious fears. Amongst Protestants, the slogan was raised that home rule, self-government, would mean Rome rule, domination by the Roman Catholic majority. And of course, as more and more people got the right to vote throughout the United Kingdom, which included Ireland, in Ireland, obviously, that meant more and more Catholics got the right to vote. So Protestants had the sense that their political position was weakening. And on top of that, this was precisely the time when the Catholic Church was becoming legal, all the penal laws were gone, it was building lots of churches, it was recruiting more clergy, it was visible. So Protestants could see what they considered to be this re-emerging popery, if you like. So that fed into their sense of paranoia. This led to a polarisation into two political blocs, a majority Catholic nationalist bloc and a minority Protestant, non-Catholic unionist bloc. So Protestants tended to vote for the Unionist Party, and they elected about 20 MPs to the London Parliament, whereas Catholics tended to vote for the Home Rule Party. That was a demand for limited autonomy, and they elected about 80 MPs to the London Parliament. Now, outside Parliament, there was a revolutionary organisation called the IRB, the Irish Republican Brotherhood. They're otherwise known as the Fenians, from the Gaelic word fianna. They were founded in 1858, and their aim was the armed overthrow of the British and the establishment of an independent republic. Now, they had a big membership amongst the Irish in North America, who, of course, remember, had fought in large numbers in the American Civil War, on both sides, but mainly in the Union armies. Not out of any sense of conviction, by the way, but it's because they simply landed in Boston, New York, and as the song famously said, had a musket put in their hand and told, you're going straight to the front, to fight for Lincoln, The song, by the way, the opening line it's called Hush Me Boys. That's just kind of, gather round, my fellas, so you hear the song. Now, normally these emigrant songs extol the virtues of the United States and call on their relatives, come on over, loads of work, loads of money. This song says, stay at home, nothing here about war, it's an exception. It's a very, very interesting song. But anyway, once the American Civil War finished, you've all these veteran Irish guys, fully trained, and remarkably, when these guys were demobilised, they could take all their gear home with them, muskets, bandoliers, the whole lot. So suddenly you had 20, 30,000, highly trained, card-carrying members of the IRB itching to have a go with the British. But of course the problem is they're on the wrong side of the Atlantic, and well, they did what you do in that situation. You invade Canada instead. So there were several schemes to invade. I think the idea was they were going to capture Canada and then swap it for Ireland. Anyway, I can see a few worried faces here. No, it didn't work out. They were eventually defeated. And that's why then the North America Act was passed, giving Canada its rather shaky constitution, so apologies for that. But anyway, they set Canada up as a confederation. But anyway, the IRB did try to mount a rising in Ireland in 1867, but that was equally unsuccessful. But despite that lack of success, they continued to operate behind the scenes. They would have been providing the muscle in the land war, for example, the strong arm stuff, burning down landlords' houses or maiming their cattle or whatever, just to kind of persuade the landlords to lower the rent or whatever. But the IRB were the main organisation behind the Easter Rising of 1916, when they were led by a school teacher called Patrick Pearse. Now, Pearse formed an alliance with a smaller revolutionary group called the Irish Citizen Army, and they had their origins in the trade union movement. In 1930, the big employers of Dublin tried to break this emerging trade union movement by locking out all unionised members. So this provoked a very bitter struggle indeed. And remember the conditions I described earlier. This is slum Dublin. These guys are the people at the very bottom. And if you want to get a flavour of what that was like, I'm recommending not a history book, but a work of fiction called Strumpet City, which is set in 1913, which gives you a whole kind of a canvas of the people at the top, the people at the bottom, the clergy, the trade union leaders, the whole lot, the conditions that people lived in. It's written by Joseph Plunkett. Strumpet City was also made into a TV miniseries, which I think is available on DVD. But anyway, the Citizen Army was led by James Connolly. Now, James Connolly was a revolutionary socialist.